So welcome to our book series. We are proud to present for you the Counterinsurgency in Crisis by David Ucko and Robert Egnell, who are to my right. David Ucko is our own. He's our associate professor at the College of International Security Affairs at National Defense University. Robert Egnell is a professor at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. And commenting on their book, we have two experts. We have retired Colonel Dave Maxwell, who was a retired Special Forces Green Beret, who actually has experience conducting coin operations, and retired Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Frank Hoffman, Marines, who also is an expert in hybrid warfare. I have asked the commentators and the speakers to keep their comments to about 12 to 15 minutes. After all four, we will go to a general discussion. I would like to remind everybody that to please identify your name, where you're from, and that everything in this arena represents people's own personal opinions. They don't represent the organizations or institutions of any particular entity. This event will be on the record, however. This is being recorded for a blog called War on the Rocks, an excellent blog which I commend to you all, but it means everything will be on the record. You can also publish this, you can't publish this book, but you can purchase this book either on Amazon, but there's a nifty code on the bottom of your brochure where you get 30% off from the publisher itself. So I encourage you to utilize that. And without further ado, I'd like to say one more thing, if that's okay. That this is actually written from a British perspective on coin. However, it has a lot of lessons to be learned, perhaps captured for the U.S. experience too. And I've asked the commentators who have graciously agreed to discuss this from a U.S. context, and Frank will take us to the next chapter at the end for his comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sean, for getting us started. I'm really honored to be here, and I want to thank David and Sean for putting this excellent panel together. And I'm delighted to see that the topic still attracts such an audience. As the first speaker, it's my duty to set the stage, and I thought I would do that by discussing a number of challenges in applying counterinsurgency approaches to the contemporary context, with a particular focus on Afghanistan. The purpose is certainly not to disown counterinsurgency. However, I would argue that it's only by understanding the challenges and the limitations of transferring past lessons to the contemporary context that we can have a frank discussion about the possibilities and benefits of certain aspects of counterinsurgency today. But first of all, what went wrong in Afghanistan? Now, we could spend probably the entire day on that particular topic. But let me start out by saying that most of the major mistakes were not completely related to counterinsurgency approaches. Let me just mention the attempt to create a highly centralized form of governance in the country, missing the window of opportunity after the fall of the Taliban regime, allowing Iraq to completely divert attention away from the international effort in Afghanistan, etc. But perhaps the mother of all failures in Afghanistan was the fact that the international coalition never managed to create certainty and consensus regarding the political and strategic aims in the country. The challenges are threefold, in my view. First of all, the campaign was conducted by three separate and poorly coordinated efforts: Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan, ISAF, and UNAMA. The second challenge is that the coalition partners have not had the same goals or political rationales for this campaign. For the US, Afghanistan has mainly been one theater in the larger war on terror, while for the European partners, this campaign has been justified on completely different grounds, mainly on state building and modernization efforts, aiming for democracy, gender equality, human rights, etc. The third challenge in terms of the aims, is that the aims and approaches to operations have shifted substantially over time. It started out as a punitive strike and the start of a counter-terror campaign. It then evolved into a much more ambitious nation-building effort, As the security situation worsened, counterinsurgency was the go-to approach. But that was only for a brief period before we lowered our ambitions again to a counter-terror campaign, and thereby sort of went full circle in Afghanistan. In a context where victory really isn't a relevant concept, the lack of political and strategic direction has had really serious consequences. Worst of all, it has failed to produce a sound strategic process. And without that process, we have also never reached a balance between the all-important ends, ways, and means of operations. And let's remind ourselves, counterinsurgency is not a strategy, it's an approach to operations. So my first main point would be, one cannot replace sound strategic thinking with an approach to operations, regardless of which approach we're using. Let's focus on the more general application of counterinsurgency as an approach in the contemporary context. My second point is that we have misinterpreted and overgeneralized the lessons of past counterinsurgency campaigns. Now, historians and military thinkers often stress the limited generalizability of operational and tactical lessons from one era to the next, or from one political context or geographic context to the next. So one would therefore assume that when we transferred or sought to transfer lessons from colonial policing of the empires to the contemporary context of stability or nation-building operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, we would be very careful to study the differences between these contexts and what lessons were relevant for the contemporary era. This wasn't done, and instead it's become clear that our contemporary version of counterinsurgency is based on a very problematic reading of history. Not only did we fail to critically engage the rather polished historical and often memoir-based accounts of past campaigns, we also applied a very liberal 21st century perspective that further exaggerated the hearts and minds approaches at the expense of the equally, if not more important, coercive methods that were often used in the past. Beyond the problematic historical reading, let me emphasize three other contextual differences that I think are very important. First of all, the actors involved have changed. These insurgents aren't quite the same guys they used to be, and the counterinsurgents are certainly not. And most importantly, I would emphasize that historical campaigns were internal affairs, while today they tend to be expeditionary operations in support of a host government. The difference is tremendous. The second difference is that the resources at hand have changed. Now, the strategic intent in Iraq and Afghanistan would have required a substantial civilian component that is missing in the contemporary context. So the old colonial powers had their colonial administrations, decades, if not centuries, of experience, cultural understanding, working in that particular context. They had local police forces who knew the local environment. All resources that we simply do not have today. And that means there's a mismatch between ambitions and resources, especially on the civilian side in contemporary operations. The third change is that we have normative changes in what's considered appropriate types of operations in contemporary warfare. We also have constant surveillance and global media sort of hanging over the shoulders of every soldier all the time. And that means that certain methods that were useful in the past, if not and perhaps not commendable, but they are at least not available to us in the contemporary context. So to sum up the contextual differences part, my third major point of this presentation is that the contextual differences should give pause for a more careful application of counterinsurgency approaches today. Now, we all use theories and strategic concepts in order to help us make sense of a rather complex reality, as well as to support the strategic process of analysis, decision-making, implementation. But I would like to emphasize that this isn't just an intellectual exercise. The concepts we choose to brand an operation or a conflict really matters. They have an impact on how we interpret the operation or the conflict, the enemy, how we prioritize resources and conduct operations. This means that whenever we pick a concept, we have to be very careful in making sure that the concept actually helps us make sense of the true nature of the problem, as well as how to deal with that problem. So how does counterinsurgency measure up with this rather utilitarian approach to concepts in Afghanistan? Well, while first of all it's been very useful in helping a lot of armed forces in the world move away from an over-focus on conventional warfare, in Afghanistan it hasn't been particularly helpful to understand the true nature of the problem, and that would be my fourth and final point. Let me explain what I mean. First of all, using the concept of counterinsurgency means that the problem has to be an insurgency. And that is not entirely clear in Afghanistan, that the nature of the problem is an insurgency. Would the defeat of the Taliban and other groups really meet our strategic aims in that country? Would it lead to stability? And again, it's hard to answer that question with a resounding yes, which means that we might have a problem in branding it as a counterinsurgency. Secondly, counterinsurgency is by definition conservative. While successful operations in the past have often involved certain concessions, they have primarily served to maintain the existing political order and to quell the agents of change. Now, given the fact that we have toppled the regimes in Iraq and Afghanistan and then instigated revolutionary societal changes in both countries, it's very hard to maintain a straight face while arguing that we were merely protecting the existing political order against change. So in fact, we were instead rather the revolutionary agents of change. And branding these efforts as counterinsurgency, I would argue, have not led us to understand our roles and responsibilities in these societies. It has also not helped us understand what kind of challenges are involved in transforming societies to the extent that we have sought to do. So let me therefore end with a slightly provocative suggestion. Perhaps it would have been more relevant to study Mao than Thompson and Galula in preparation for these campaigns. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to all of you who've come here to attend this book launch panel discussion. Thanks to Robert for your comments, and thanks to Sean and the other panelists for being here. I'd also just like to extend my sincere gratitude to all of those people who made this event possible, seeing as this is a CISA event and I'm a CISA employee. So Rebecca, thank you very much. Amy, Nicole, Paul, and of course Chancellor Mike Bell. Thanks a lot for your support in making this event a possibility. I think we're really at a critical juncture at which to discuss the topic of counterinsurgency and of strategic options for the future. We've left Afghanistan, and it's become increasingly clear to me, at least, that whereas we want the rights that go along with global leadership, we're not that comfortable with the costs and the responsibilities. We will have to find new ways of managing world order, if that's still the business that we're in. Now, the conversation to this point has perhaps unavoidably been marked by certain slogans, mantras, and dogmas. No more Iraq, no more Afghanistan, so counterinsurgency is dead. I find none of these statements particularly helpful in charting a way forward. I mean, of course, no one in their right mind would want to do another Iraq again or another Afghanistan again. That doesn't need to be said. But we also have to remember that none of those campaigns began as counterinsurgencies. They evolved to that point, and I think there's a level of danger, even of hubris, if we think that we can dominate the operational environment in future engagements and simply let go when it evolves in a direction that we do not like. More fundamentally, there's some key lessons that really need to be learned from the last decade. So to say no more Iraqs, no more Afghanistans, these were errors, I think it starts us off on the wrong foot. Iraq and Afghanistan, more than any other recent campaign that the West has been involved in, shows the full complexity of modern armed conflict. the complexity of operating in a different language, in a different culture, in an unknown terrain, against irregular armed groups, all while trying to build up the political capacity and legitimacy of a structure that can take our military gains and find some way of politically consolidating them. I don't think that complexity is going to disappear. I think, in fact, it's unavoidable whenever you're trying to achieve political objectives through force of arms. So we can choose whether we're going to own that complexity or simply pass it off to someone else, as arguably we did in Libya. But it's still going to be there, and we still have to anticipate it, and we're still going to have to deal with its consequences, at least if we wish to be strategically effective. Now, I want to be clear on this. That does not mean that we have to do Iraq and Afghanistan all over again, that we don't have a choice. Of course, we have to exercise agency to the best of our ability. But nor can we return to this pre-Iraq mindset that sees war as a apolitically, militarily decisive event of confrontation that happens on some unpopulated battlefield, where the last man standing basically is the victor. We need instead to think far more creatively on the basis of our experience in the last 10 years about how we can engage with the complexity of war, yet without falling into the pitfalls that we've perhaps seen and witnessed in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, it's reassuring that there's still innovation and thinking and people who want to take this type of debate forward. And I was very pleased to read just some material from the joint publication 3-24 that NDU's own Center for Complex Operations has a leading hand in. It shows that there is a willingness on some, at least, to take the debate forward. But I also fear that there are equal, if not greater, forces seeking sort of a backlash and a return to status quo ante. And it is in that context that we wrote this book, Counterinsurgency in Crisis, because I think that's exactly where the concept and some of the lessons learned the last decade reside. In this book, we propose 3 different ways in which the West can still manage world affairs, but perhaps without repeating past errors. And I'm going to go through them, try not to spend too much time, and then we can discuss them perhaps more in the Q&A. The first option is one that we entitled rather provocatively as Death from Above, and this takes us back to Libya. The Libya model, previously known as the Afghan model, consists primarily of the use of air force, launching precision-guided munitions, but also, of course, soft elements on the ground, linking air to ground or linking the Air Force to a local ground proxy that then plays a role that the U.S. Army or Marine Corps would traditionally serve. This model or this option has always been very alluring since it was first tried in the Balkans. And it compares fairly well, as I'm sure you can imagine, to sort of messy, on-the-ground counterinsurgency campaigns seen more recently. In both Kosovo and Libya, NATO saw 0 casualties, which is something of a historical anomaly. The campaigns were of a shorter duration, a lower cost. And of course, if you look at the outcome, which is of course what we should be concerned with, at first blush, both campaigns went fairly well. At least it's difficult to argue that they went less well than when we put boots on the ground in Afghanistan and Iraq. So you can kind of see the rationale of those people who come away from these experiences saying this is the way we ought to fight. But the model does come with some key prerequisites and conditions for its effectiveness, and I think we need to really bear those in mind. First of all, operational considerations. In Libya, the war was fought largely in the desert, which of course really facilitates the targeting from air. But more fundamentally, the enemy always has a vote. We saw in Libya how Gaddafi's forces adapted to our preferred way of fighting. They started using the same vehicles as the rebels. They stopped forming large units that were easy targets or easy targets for airstrikes. Now, of course, for Gaddafi, that adaptation came way too late, and it was, strategically insignificant. But we saw similar types of adaptation in Afghanistan, and we saw it also in the Balkans. And I think we'd be foolish to think that future adversaries are not going to learn from this and try to find ways of making our preferred way of fighting far less effective. At some point, that may very well call for boots on the ground. And if we're truly committed to the strategic aims that we pursue, then that's a possibility we may also have to consider. More fundamentally, perhaps, we need to speak about the political consequences of the Libyan approach or the Afghan model. We are then in the business of empowering a proxy on the ground to do certain military activities that we'd rather not do ourselves for good and bad reasons. But what happens with those forces once the model is put back on the shelf, once the bombardment stops? I mean, no one really remembers Afghanistan now for the Afghan model put into effect in 2001, 2002. And I would argue that Libya increasingly is being remembered not for the initial way in which we intervened, but rather because of the regional and national destabilizing forces that intervention, in fact, unleashed. Now, I'm not saying that we should have gone in, heavy boots on the ground and, FM 3-24 and clear whole build. That might have been equally, if not more, foolish. But it does point to this singular and undeniable fact that the Afghan model or the Libya model, call it what you will, does not make intervention significantly easier. It's not clinical, it's not cheap. It simply offloads responsibility for political consolidation onto another actor. And if we want to take this route, we need to become far better at relating and at working with that actor so as to achieve common political objectives. I think that political area, that strategic area, is one part where we're still, sadly, very much lacking. The second option for engagements that we've seen, and what I propose as a viable alternative, is the indirect approach. This is the use of advisory or assistance to augment the capacity and capability of a host nation government so that they can basically fight their own fight. So the West is in the back seat. This is the approach used in El Salvador in the 1980s, and for the British, the key case is Dhofar. These were both relatively successful campaigns fought vicariously or indirectly. The advantage here is clear because we're not in the front seat, we're not in the driver's seat. These interventions appear less risky, more discreet, lower in costs and in profile. It leaves the fighting to the local forces, who anyway know the terrain and the culture and everything far better than we do. And of course, it also puts far more responsibility in the hands of the local government, whose problem it is to solve. It's ultimately their legitimacy and their survival that's at stake. So there's great merit to this approach. But I do think that we need to, again, think about the broader strategic context. And there's three key considerations that we should always bear in mind whenever we seek to do these advisory missions. First, advisory work is an art all in and of itself. There's two key challenges. They're fairly obvious. Raising the capability of a foreign force, and secondly, ensuring that that capability is used in ways that are appropriate for the mission objectives. Now, these are endemic challenges. We've seen them in indirect campaigns, we've seen them in direct campaigns. They're always going to be there. One of the lessons from the last 10 years has been that partnering can be an effective remedy for some of these problems. Partnering here is taken to mean advisors living with the troops that they're training day and night, operating from the same environment, living in the same outpost, and basically teaching on the job. Now, partnering, as we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan, has helped to address, though not entirely eliminate, problems of leverage, accountability, and ensuring a steady learning curve. But of course, the implication for the need for partnering is pretty significant. We need to have advisors then who are adept in the language, the culture, who are able to live and operate in a rugged environment for protracted periods of time, alongside a very different force. And the real question here for the indirect approach, if we're going to do this on any significant scale, is do we have the advisors capable of doing this? Do we teach, do we prepare, and do we educate people to take on this very arduous task? Now, on the one hand, we have the special forces and SOF and so forth, and I think they have much more of that capability than the general purpose forces. Okay, but the question then is, do they have the capacity? Special operation forces are special for a reason. They can't easily be mass-produced. So if we're thinking about doing the indirect approach in countries, particularly if they're bigger than, say, El Salvador, I think we're going to have to think very hard about the type of investment necessary to spread this capability within the general purpose forces. And so far, I haven't seen enough progress on that front to warrant much optimism. I think it's erroneous, in other words, to look at the indirect approach as counterinsurgency on the cheap. It requires significant political buy-in, institutional commitment to create the required capabilities, but also to allow those troops to operate from the front line in very risky environments. This is not going to be the risk-free option. Finally, of course, and it bears noting, even though it's an obvious point, the indirect approach requires a partner to partner with. So we need to be prepared for those circumstances where partners do not avail themselves. Colombia, the Philippines, El Salvador, DOFA, all had functioning, if highly dysfunctional, government structures through which to operate. But would the indirect approach have been effective in Iraq in 2003, or in any other context where the central structures have been overthrown, or where you have a case of extreme state failure? So again, much as with the Libyan approach or Libyan model, we need to prepare for cases where our preferred way of fighting simply won't fit. And what are we going to do about that? Finally, and I think from a more strategic angle, the indirect approach does not remove the need for strategy. It should be obvious that in efforts to conduct counterinsurgency operations or to defeat an insurgency movement, the professionalization of an armed force is only one of several things or initiatives that need to pass. If the political objectives that those forces are contributing towards are not appropriate or not being served or implemented in a functioning sense, then there's very little that a military force can do about it. We're told again and again that counterinsurgency is 80% political and 20% military, so we need to think about the political part even when we're talking about the indirect approach. By analogy, it serves very little purpose sharpening the scalpel if the doctor operating is drunk. And that is exactly the type of problem that we faced again and again in these types of advisory missions. In Dhofar, for example, the security gains that the British advisors were enabling meant very little so long as the Sultan Said bin Taimur was at the helm with his repressive regime. It was only when his own son had overthrown the Sultan and incorporated a completely different campaign plan with political lines of effort and other reform mechanisms that the grievances underpinning the insurgency could actually be addressed. And that's when the campaign moved into the happy sort of direction that we remember it for today. So again, the political content must take the lead, not the military. And now in Dhofar it worked out okay, but that's not to say that this is always going to be the case. And I refer to the US advisory experience in Vietnam with the Diem regime for a less positive vignette. The overriding point is that the indirect approach requires dissuasion, leverage, and compulsion, diplomatic tasks that we're not good enough at, quite frankly. And I don't mean that as a criticism of the United States. It's, I think, a broader Western weakness, one that we need to think very seriously about if we continue to be in this game. The third and final option that I want to cover is what I call contingency operations, and it's what's exemplified perhaps best by the French forces in sub-Saharan Africa when they go in and help the United Nations either during a severe crisis or sudden deterioration in security. Operation Serval is one example, there are many others. The appeal here, much as with the other options, is a limited ownership. We use our comparative advantage, the technological edge, to go in, basically bomb a few things, take some territory, and then we hand over to the UN and to the local forces who do sort of the cleaning up, the stuff that we rather not get involved in. This can work. I mean, it sounds cynical, but it can work very effectively. The Sierra Leone operation, the British Sierra Leone operation in 2000, I think is probably the best illustration of how this can work. You had British troops that were in and out a matter of months, yet the intervention significantly helped the country move from a bloody conflict, I mean exceptionally bloody, to sustained peace. Not a perfect peace, but a peace nonetheless. The key requirement here is ensuring that those who take on the vestigial duties are able to do so, and that they have been trained up, whether they've been reinforced to a point where they can actually do what we expect them to do. So the key to the British success in Sierra Leone was really the longer-term advisory mission, a 140-strong team that stayed behind in Sierra Leone to bolster the capabilities of a UN mission that had itself been boosted as a result of Security Council resolutions. Basically, the British went in knowing that they were also going to have to reinforce not only the Sierra Leonean army, but also the UN presence on the ground. And that, I think, is what really accounts for the sustained stability seen there from then on. In contrast, if you look at the French operation in DRC in 2005, Operation Artemis, you have a very different scenario. Again, 3 months, a very short operation. The French insisted upon it. But what happened when they left was that the UN mission was not sufficiently strong, the local powers remained underdeveloped, and the country, of course, is far larger than Sierra Leone. And I think more politically speaking, the ripeness for a resolution simply wasn't there. So the effect of the French operation was mostly just to displace violence for 3 months, and when they left, the violence returned. So the lesson as regards contingency ops really touch upon the ability to deploy a force quickly and achieve local dominance, but also the ability to sustain that force until local political and military structures are prepared to take over. And that is what gives long-term political meaning to short-term military expeditions. So again, we come back to the broader strategic and diplomatic functions at the very heart of these types of operations. A war is a continuation of politics by other means, right? So to conclude, let me just say one final thing about Sierra Leone. Another key requirement in Sierra Leone for the Brits was timing. There was a war wariness in the country itself. Regional developments regarding Guinea and Liberia produced a promising opportunity for intervention. And the British went in, and whether it was chance or skill, they spotted that opportunity and they exploited it very effectively. This speaks to the need for strategic acumen, the ability to know when to intervene, how to spot and use local opportunities, and how to integrate them within a campaign plan. The requirement for sound strategic thinking and prosecution is inescapable, no matter what of the options I've discussed we decide to use, no matter how we intervene. It's just the nature of the game. And sadly, I think we're not quite good enough at that part of it. This speaks in part to what Robert mentioned in terms of ends, ways, means, prioritization, sequencing, and the whole lot. But it also speaks to a need for greater knowledge about the countries that we seek to transform. We need to foster local partners in conflict-affected parts of the country, of the world. We need to understand their interests and agendas so that we can actually work together, identify common objectives, and operate as a team to meet them. This, of course, relies on having an interest in the world that I find sometimes can be entirely lacking. Another final key challenge, regardless of which option we choose, is the burden sharing. You may have noticed that whether we're talking about the Libya model or the indirect approach, the point is, in a sense, to offload some responsibility onto someone else. But if Afghanistan has taught us anything, is that you can't fight with allies, but you can't fight without them. So we need to probably think a little bit more carefully about this. How do we find common objectives? How do we find partners who are willing to do what it takes to address what they consider to be truly serious problems? And I would argue that in NATO, for example, many of the participant countries do not see what's going on there as a serious problem, or else we've seen a different level of resource allocation and prioritization. So this is also a challenge for the United States, of course. Is the United States willing to do what it takes? We should really ask ourselves, before we go any further into this discussion about different types of option, whether we're adopting these options because they're truly the best strategy at hand, or because they seem to make intervention more easy. Because if it's a latter, then unfortunately, interventions are never easy. They're never going to be easy. And in fact, I think they're only going to become more complicated if we mistake them as such. With that, I'll leave over. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you, Sean and David, for hosting this, and National Defense University. Also, happy to see so many of our Georgetown students. Robert and I are very happy to see, and Sean as well, to see so many Georgetown students here. I'm going to talk, David asked me to talk a little bit about what he called the indirect approach and about operations in the Philippines. And so the title I'm using is A Special Warfare Approach to Counterinsurgency and Counterterrorism, really executed through foreign internal defense. The Philippines is a very unique situation for the United States. As I'm sure everybody knows, it is the only former colony of the United States, so there is a colonial relationship there. It is unique, and many people tout the success of the Philippines, and I would caveat this and say that if there is any success in the Philippines, it is because of the Philippine Armed Forces, not because of the introduction of U.S. forces, and I think that's something to keep in mind. Many people call it a model, the Philippine model, the Baslan model, but I would say it is certainly not the model. As we've talked about, the conditions are very different in the Philippines than in Iraq and Afghanistan. It certainly is a model for how to support an ally in their fight against lawlessness, subversion, insurgency, and terrorism. But it is not the model. And so I ask you to think about that and not call it the model. The threat in the Philippines is very complex, and I I respect the Philippine government and military for what they have to deal with. Multiple insurgencies, the Moro National Liberation Front, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, the Communist Party of the Philippines and the New People's Army, the existential threat to the Philippine government, the terrorist groups, the Abu Sayyaf, JI from Indonesia, as well as criminal organizations, the Pentagon Gang, and then the RIDOs, which are really clan warfare and political violence. It's really a cauldron of very complex threats that they face. And of course, today in the Philippines, we shouldn't forget about the regional tensions, the friction with the territorial issues that exist, China and the like. So it's a very complex threat situation that the Philippines faces, and they are our longest-standing treaty ally, and we have a long relationship. Prior to 9/11, we were dealing with our allies supporting them in many things. We had a year before 9/11, because of the Sipadan kidnapping crisis, Gracia and Martin Burnham and Deborah Yap kidnapped and held by the Abu Sayyaf. We started with a mobile training team, a security assistance mission to stand up their national level counterterrorism force, the Light Reaction Company. All this done prior to 9/11. So we have a long-standing relationship with them. But with 9/11, obviously things changed. As we focused on Afghanistan, the Pacific Command, Admiral Blair, said, it's time for us to provide more support to the Philippine government. And while we were deploying to Afghanistan, we began conducting an assessment in the Philippines, something very different. We went to Afghanistan in extremis. In the Philippines, we were able to conduct a top-to-bottom assessment, strategic to tactical, in conjunction with Philippine military officers, and really developed a joint campaign plan for how U.S. forces were going to support the armed forces of the Philippines. Something obviously very different than Iraq and Afghanistan. We were able to truly, as David said, partner with our allies in development of the plans and, of course, in execution. Just to put in a little historical context, everybody's familiar with our pacification in the early 20th century with General Pershing and our operations there, with post-World War II and the Huck Rebellion, our advisory assistance effort with General Lansdale, very small footprint, the smallest footprint probably of all the actions that have taken place probably in the 20th century. And then Operation Enduring Freedom Philippines, and it splits the difference between pacification and the very small advisory element. But from a doctrinal perspective, this was really a foreign internal defense mission. And if you look at the bottom of this slide here, just as a cheat sheet, there's indirect FID, direct FID, and combat FID. And if you laid it out, our Title 22 security assistance was really indirect FID, mobile training teams, even IMET, things like that. Direct FID, we're conducting a lot around the world. Georgia Train and Equip, Caribbean and Central America, of course Philippines, Colombia, Transahal, Horn of Africa, many direct FID operations around the world. And of course Iraq and Afghanistan, you could characterize them as combat FID, where U.S. and Iraq, Afghanistan forces are conducting variations of foreign internal defense. We call in Special Forces and the new Army Doctrine 3-0, ADP 3-05 that came out in August of 2012, it defines the two major special operations as special warfare and surgical strike. And I think David characterized in his remarks what it takes for the indirect approach. Special warfare, the execution of activities that involved a combination of lethal and non-lethal actions taken by specially trained and educated force, has a deep understanding of cultures and foreign language, proficiency in small unit tactics, and the ability to build and fight alongside indigenous combat formations in a permissive, uncertain, or hostile environment. That is really the essence of the forces, Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines, that were making up the Joint Special Operations Task Force. Not all special operations, regular forces as well, but that really describes the type of operations and the mindset and that needs to be part of these operations. Surgical strike is, of course, what we're really familiar with in special operations. And we have the greatest surgical strike capability in the world. The execution of activities in a precise manner that employs special operations in hostile, denied, or politically sensitive environments to seize, destroy, capture, exploit, recover, or damage designated targets, or influence adversaries and threats. In the Philippines, we conducted no surgical strike operations. Afghanistan and Iraq, we're conducting various forms of special warfare and surgical strike. Just one last piece of doctrinal definition, which I think is really worth emphasizing, which existed, obviously, before 9/11, but I think has often been overlooked, and that is the definition of foreign internal defense. A couple key words: participation by civilian and military agencies of a government in any of the action programs taken by another government or other designated organization to free and protect its society from subversion, lawlessness, insurgency, terrorism, and other threats to its security. FID is a supporting mission, supporting to another government or another organization. And if you think about that, and it is inherently joint and interagency, not SOF unique. Even though FID is a Title X SOF designated mission, it is not exclusive to SOF. And in fact, the doctrine prior to 9/11 said all the services are supposed to provide forces trained and ready to conduct FID. It's already in our doctrine. So, the doctrinal and historical context, I want to talk about the campaign plan. We conducted this assessment. We developed this campaign plan. At the end of October 2001, we briefed Admiral Blair, who was SINCPAC at the time. I can call him SINCPAC because in 2001 we were still calling him SINCs, I think. But now the commander of the Pacific Command. We briefed him and we laid out this campaign plan. Lieutenant General Friedovich was the commander of 1st Special Forces Group. Then Brigadier General Donnie Worcester was the commander of Special Operations Command Pacific. Admiral Blair asked a key question: how long is this going to take? And General Friedovich said at the time, well, by advising and assisting, we're looking at 8, 10, 12 years, to really achieve some effects. This is a long-term proposition. There is no simple, easy solution. And of course, I think that has borne out. But I'd like to point out something that we don't often talk about, which you see at the top is the mission statement. I think this mission statement is very important because it really encompasses the nature of this type of operation. And I can say it's very good because I didn't write it. Bill Medina at SOCPAC wrote this, crafted it, and I think it's really worth emphasizing. First is that the Joint Special Operations Task Force, in coordination with the country team, that is critical. FID is inherently interagency. So in coordination with the country team, and there was a real partnership, still is today, between the military and the rest of the country team. So build capacity, strengthen the Republic of the Philippines security forces, defeat selected terrorist organizations, and of course the emphasis is on terrorist organizations. Conplan 7500, everything was Al-Qaeda related, so we were very limited to the terrorist organizations, the Abu Sayyaf and JI, who had direct linkage to AQ. So the focus was on terrorism, but the problem was much bigger, of course. So in order to protect Philippine and U.S. interests and citizens, while preserving Philippine sovereignty, and that was really the underlying, the foundation for what we are doing is the recognition of the importance and, of course, the respect for sovereignty of the Philippines. And that approach, it was inculcated in all members of the organization, because if we violate sovereignty, if we undercut the legitimacy of the Philippine government, the Philippine military, then, of course, we are counterproductive. So that mission statement, very succinct, really ties together, I think, the essence of these types of operations. And, because rarely do you see country team and sovereignty in a mission statement. So I commend people to consider that. We use four very simple lines of operation. Capacity building, the essence of our advise and assist, and the full range of advise and assist, not only tactical, but logistical, intelligence, civil affairs, psychological operations, or MISO, building capacity across the spectrum of the military, and, of course, not just their special operations forces. The predominant forces were Philippine Army and Marine regular forces. Targeted civil military operations. We talk about conditions, changing conditions, very hard to do, but targeted civil military operations really provides an opportunity for the Philippine security forces to have access and influence, to get into areas that are contested, and of course, one of the key tasks in counterinsurgency, separating the insurgents and terrorists from the population. But civil military operations gives them a way to enter these areas. Intelligence operations, key. And the fusion of all disciplines, bringing our high-tech, our national-level assets, local human assets, being able to exploit the intelligence for targeting and the like, that was really one of our big contributions, but also very much behind the scenes. And lastly, influence operations. As I said, it's all about host nation legitimacy and ensuring that we do that, that we protect that. Let me give you 3 just quick war stories, just to illustrate something. As I said, this wasn't just a special operation. In 2006, we conducted Operation Ultimatum, which was a nighttime, simultaneous dual amphibious landing by Philippine Marines and Special Operations Forces. And the purpose was using deception by conducting an amphibious operation which the Abu Sayyaf had never seen, and to really counteract their human intelligence network that knew wherever any Philippine or U.S. military force was moving. We conducted this amphibious operation, and it was very successful. It removed a large logistic support structure and sanctuary areas that were able to really reduce the capability of the Abu Sayyaf. But I mention that because it was a conventional amphibious operation. The Marines, part of the task force, instrumental in helping the Philippine Marines, advising and assisting. But even though this was counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, there's still a role for the types of operations that our military is very, very good at, best in the world. Now, the second is that we spent a lot of time countering the unconventional warfare networks of the Abu Sayyaf, their auxiliary and their underground. Again, using intelligence, signals intelligence, as well as human intelligence, really to determine where their safe houses were, how they were resupplying their forces logistically, where their weapons caches were. And Philippine Navy SEALs, the Light Reaction Company, their special forces, their scout rangers, were able to precisely take down targets and really reduce this infrastructure. Again, much kind of like, in many ways, hearkening back to Phoenix in Vietnam and the like there, to be able to target that infrastructure, but understanding how they were employing unconventional warfare tactics and the like. The last thing is we spent a lot of time with our psychological operations forces working on dissent and discord, trying to split the lower level members of the terrorist organization from their leadership. And it really culminated in the death of the high value target, the subsequent leader of the Abu Sayyaf, Abu Solomon, which, just a quick mention, it took about 10 months to do that, and it was a result of them conducting a terrorist bombing that killed their fellow Muslims. The dissent and discord really influenced low-level ASG, in particular a wife of a member, to become an informant, providing cell phone information of Abu Solomon. And she said, why are you a member of the Abu Sayyaf? What have they done for us? I can't even put milk on the table yet. The Philippine military is treating our children for medical care, building schools and roads, and we have no money. And so he became an informant, provided really critical information. About 10 months later, we got information that there was that his handset was located. And the Philippine Special Forces conducted an operation, killed him, and eliminated that leader. And I mention that because it took a long time to develop that operation for one HVT, but it was the culmination of much work and effort. Just want to touch on some key lessons. Assessment is really critical. Initial assessment and continuous assessment of the conditions, and adapt the campaign plan. Through and with. We used to say by, through, and with, but now in Special Forces we say through and with. It's not a cliche. U.S. forces are not in charge in these operations, and we have to understand that. We're not simply putting a Filipino face on the operation. They have to truly be in the lead, and we respect that and support that. Lastly, I just want to make 2 points, is that the fundamental doctrine exists. And in fact, we have a lot of historical precedents. David talked about how do we train advisors. I would recommend looking at the Joint Staff J7 Lessons Learned that was produced in June 2012. It recommends in there the revitalization of the MATA course, the Military Advisor Training Assistance course that was run out of the Special Warfare Center and School during Vietnam, to train not only special forces, but conventional advisors as well. And I think that is something that we should go back to. And I would say that even though COIN seems to be on the way out, we need to maintain expertise in COIN. We need to be able to advise and assist. We don't necessarily need to conduct COIN ourselves. We didn't conduct COIN in the Philippines. We were advising and assisting those to conduct COINs. We need to maintain that expertise to be able to assist others. And I would say that everything we need to do in the future, we've done in the past, and we only need to examine the past and adapt it for the future conditions. And with that, I will stop. Sorry.
I think everybody can hear me. I don't want to stand up and preach a little bit. Very happy to be here. Very happy to discuss this fine book. I'd like to point out that Sean underplayed some of my expertise in irregular warfare, because I've partly responsible for raising 4 daughters. I've gotten them all into their 20s. I'm still alive. They're still alive. Obviously, I've mastered separation of irreconcilables from reconcilables. I've mastered non-kinetics. I know a lot about hearts and minds, and a little bit about sticks and carrots. Probably a lot more carrots than sticks, unfortunately. I'm also very aware that context in the conduct of counterinsurgency is very important. It's late in the day. There's booze on the other wall, on the side over here, and I know some of you know about it, and you want to maneuver over there very quickly, so I'll try to be short. There's no greater evidence of the character of the global insurgency we face today than the scholars that put together this fine book. 2 Swedes, or Swedish gentlemen and Swedish scholars sitting in the United States, have conducted a fairly searing and scholarly investigation of British performance in Afghanistan. I only wish that somebody was going to do that here, and that's the basis of my argument today, is somebody, and perhaps these 2 gentlemen, they're certainly qualified, or perhaps some people in the room, will undertake the challenge. If I can figure out the technology here. Yeah, I think we need somebody here in the United States, not to discuss Britain and modern war, but the United States and the challenges of modern war. And somebody here in the audience, I'm sure, and somebody here on the stage is probably qualified. And I would title that book either Learning in Crisis or Strategy in Crisis, not Counterinsurgency. Also agree with David's fine ending there. I don't think we're very good at learning. The learning that we have had over the years, as Bernard Brody suggests, has been limited or imperfect. I think the debates we have about counterinsurgency, debates we're having about Vietnam today and the relationship between Vietnam and Iraq suggest that we really haven't really defined what the true lessons are and haven't wrestled with that with any detail. I agree that we have published a pretty nice operational lessons learned product, and I really commend the tone and the scholarship behind that particular work. But I think we need to raise it up to what I call strategic learning or a strategic level, and we've not done that. And David, I think, and Robert have done that in their book, again, but from a British perspective with great lessons for us to consider. The indictment that is included in this book, as stated here, is, again, a searing but scholarly and sober, and I think has been substantiated. I've shared this with some of my British friends, and everyone's, nods their head that this is probably true. But you could take this indictment that's in this book, and you could remove the words UK and the word British, and sometimes insert the word American or United States or coalition, and probably come to the same conclusions. The one exception I might make here is I'm not sure that we let strategic intent and operational approach develop independently, but there is an accusation in the public record that we let operational approach drive strategy. Not that they were independent, but they were backwards. And I think this indictment holds true, and I think it's a serious one that we need to consider, and somebody ought to take it up. And I have a grant proposal for a few $100K that I'm I'm trolling for money for, to see if we can get somebody interested in helping us do that. And again, the indictment continues, the bridge between what we wanted to see happen and what actually happened, the bridge between policies, aims, and our tactics often seem to be uncrossed. And the discourse that should have occurred probably didn't go back. Again, this commentary from Robert and David, capacity for strategic thinking, formulating strategies, formulating campaign plans, aligning ends, ways, and means, sequencing, devising, implementing, reassessing, and adapting a theory of victory. Something that I'm not sure that both in Afghanistan and Iraq, which would be a much broader topic than what these two gentlemen have done, I think you can say the same thing about the United States and have a serious scholarly effort to take that on. I also very much appreciate the strategic options that these two gentlemen laid out, again, of what Britain could do coming out of this war. And they're obviously, I think as all of us have discussed today, these are potential strategic options that the United States might consider. In fact, I would argue that the first three that they discussed for Britain is, in essence, our strategic guidance right now coming out of the war. And I would suggest, as this book does, that these might be the wrong strategic lessons. Yes, we can invest in niche investments and we can buy some more drones or maintain the drones we have. But in and of itself, that's not a strategy. And in itself, it will not probably be enough. We can take more indirect approaches. We can invest in FID, and we should when we can get in early and I think work a problem. There are options for unconventional warfare that I think we should mature and expand and invest in, and David's a great advocate for many of those things. I think we can hope for proxies. We can hope to unload burdens to others. We can build partnerships. But again, most of these places that need help are challenged for one reason or another, and that all these three options basically represent the illusion of hope or a desire for hope to walk away from coin. I'd like to echo something that both Davids have talked about today. This is not a wake for coin. I think it would be very premature to think that we need to have a wake for coin. Our enemies have learned a lot from us. As the Petraeus quote suggests, the counterinsurgency era is not over because the insurgents are not over, and the insurgents haven't stopped learning, and I would suggest that then we too need to stop learning. So there is other options we need to consider. I doubt they're going to be in this next QDR. I doubt they're going to be in changes to guidance, but they perhaps should be. We should have a fourth option up here, and I would suggest it's being good at irregular warfare across the force. And of course, the guidance says that we want to retain these as capabilities, but it doesn't suggest that it's worth investing in. And there is too much, I think, walking away from this particular challenge. So I really do agree with the thrust of this book. Coin, stab ops, complex ops, whatever you want to call it, are not going away, cannot go away, will not go away, and we need to consider that as a strategic challenge. There's a couple strategic lessons that my own work suggests. We've taken away a lot of operational and tactical adaptations. I think the military's been extremely agile and adapted, but I'm not quite sure at the strategic level that I'm interested here in Washington, D.C., that we really absorbed the strategic lessons. Policy development process. How effective was U.S. policy development process? How has it been adapted, and how should it adapt more? Decision-making structures and processes. How well did the existing decision-making process adapt, and how did that process serve the development of clear options and subsequent decisions? And are procedural, structural, or educational initiatives warranted? Yes or no? How have we changed things here at National Defense University and in Washington, D.C.? Unity of effort. How effective was our government at integrating all instruments of national power at the strategic and in the operational level? And more importantly, I think a debate I have in myself in my research is unity of effort in the comprehensive approach, really doable, yes or no? Command and control or unity of effort? And what do we take away from 12 years of experience? Civil-military relations, which includes trust, mutual understanding, maybe a common language about what the health strategy is or what the options are. How well was the NSC integrated with DOD and the coalitions? Was unity of effort at the summit achieved? I've read a few books lately, and there's one in the press of getting a lot of publicity lately that suggests that unity of effort, that mutual interaction was not well achieved. Mr. Gates's book suggests that the answer is in the negative. And I'm hoping Amazon delivers my copy tonight. I'll find out. Coalition management and host nation interaction. I have friends in the UK that tell us we are a hard party to partner with. Who is willing to go out and do the research to find out what it is that we've done wrong, and who is it that's going to consolidate those kind of responses and advise the United States on what it is to be a good partner with the United States? If we're going to rely upon others and expect others to come and work with us, I think it behooves us to understand what partnership really means, rather than passing the buck or expecting somebody else to pick up the burden. Crafting and communication narratives is a little bit of a hobby horse of mine, but there is a strong ideological and information component to irregular warfare. We are not masters of this. I don't even think we're journeymen at it at any level. Mr. Rumsfeld, Mr. Gates, I think the current SecDef, would agree with that. What initiatives in public diplomacy, information operations, and crafting and distributing narratives can we take away from a decade of war? Finally, national security reform. There was a major project that this university participated in the Project for National Security Reform. There was many recommendations out of that process. Some of the people who were advocates of those process changes went into government. We've got 12 years of laboratory experience. We have hard data now. What needs to go forward? What needs to change? What can we institutionalize that we didn't have evidence for or we couldn't make an argument for a decade or 12 years ago? And I think there's a lot of folks here in the audience you can add to this list, but we could go on for quite a period of time probably and discuss potential lessons. So sort of in wrapping up, Stanley Hoffman, I think, got it right. No relation. And in the parentheses there is my paraphrasing of Stanley Hoffman. Of all the disasters from the last decade, the worst thing we could possibly do is not learn the lessons that we paid for with treasure and blood over the last decade. Many lessons have been observed, some have been noted, some have been recorded, some have been debated, but very few have been resolved or institutionalized. And I think the ultimate recognition of the sacrifices that our allies have made and that our own country has made is to absorb those and institutionalize and truly learn them as best we can. And with that, I'll close and leave it to the moderator here for some discussion.